Hello again. Welcome back to my course, World History. Today, if you follow our syllabus, you will notice that today we're going to discuss the topic of imperialism. Okay, but again, as always, I would like you to link a topic we discuss next time with the one that we discussed prior to this. Okay. So let's review what we did last time. Remember, our last conversation was about so-called nationalism. Okay? Nationalism was, I would say, the most influential modern ideology. As you remember, we talked about four major ideologies that developed in the modern time. And again, these were classical liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and finally what we did last time, I repeat myself again, nationalism. Remember what was nationalism all about and how it was developing. One of the major messages of nationalism was disseminating this feeling of being part of same nation. Okay, that is why we use this expression, imagined communities, the expression that was introduced by scholar Benedict Anderson. In modern times, and primarily because of these changes introduced by the Industrial Revolution, the increase in communication, mobility, traveling, railroads. Remember, railroad was a big deal. Okay, in fact, keep in mind three things for you to remember how modern life, Industrial Revolution, literally opened the doors to nationalism. I wouldn't say that some sparks of nationalism had not existed before. They did, but there was not much room for them to spread around this sensation that you are part of the same nation. But when you have railroads, when you have factories where people come and they begin feeling like they belong to the same culture, they speak the same language despite the differences in dialects. Okay, you have print culture, which means newspapers. You have schooling, you have military draft. All these things, they contribute to building what became known as nationalism. Okay, so prior to this, prior to modern society, nationalism hardly existed. Why? Because people had this village mentality. Their worldview was restricted by the borders of their village. They could know the name of their king, but not everybody. They knew that they belonged to a particular church, but they didn't know that they were part of the same nation because they never thought about it. So it's a essentially modern phenomenon, nationalism. Okay, so we have a few highly advanced industrial countries that came to think about themselves as nations, and we have French nation, we have Italian nation, we have English. Okay, we have Swedish, we have the Danish, we have the Dutch, people from Netherlands, and eventually we have Germans. Remember, Germany was one of the last major countries of Western Europe to be united. Okay, it was a big deal. And final after the Civil War, what we have? We have the American nation. Remember, one of the last things I mentioned last time, it was a story about how the Union Pacific Railroad was built. Okay, that any railroad wasn't possible before the Civil War, when the country was divided in two parts. But when Civil War was over and the whole country became united into a single nation, so that is why we have this project of their Union Pacific Railroad, 1869, connecting, literally connecting like a glue, East and West Coast. And that's what the complete of the nation. Nation was complete. National holidays were accepted by many people. Okay, like Thanksgiving, like playing a baseball game, you know, such things, I repeat, had not existed on a nationwide scale in the United States. These things became ingrained in the life of the American nation after the Civil War. Okay, so how do we link nationalism with what we're going to do today, imperialism? First, let me define what imperialism means. Imperialism, basically, it's an expansion of a particular country, of particular countries which are powerful enough to expand, and it's taking over other countries' lands and controlling them. Okay, so we have in the second half of the 19th century, we have the entire globe been divided among the major European powers, and plus the United States and Japan, by the way. So by the end of the 19th century, we have the entire globe been divided among the European countries, Japan, and the United States. That will be the best way to put it. Okay. From the list of countries which I mentioned right now, you may understand, and it's a right understanding, that imperialism, it's not a totally European phenomenon. Okay. For example, right now you have China expanding to different countries of Africa, literally hijacking them. Okay. And a lot of African countries become dependent on China, financially, economically, politically. So that's an example of imperialism. Okay. There was expansion of Spain and Portugal to where? To the Western Hemisphere, when Portugal and Spain took over chunks of land in Latin America. Okay. But the major job of division the world among major powers was done by these nations, which I mentioned right now. It's European nations, US and Japan, by the end of the 19th century. So the reason we singled out so-called Western nations and Japan is because at that time, and I repeat, it's time, the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. These were the countries which came to call the shots in the world, okay? And I'm going to explain to you how this expansion was done by European countries, and plus Japan and United States. Imperialism was conducted by countries that were powerful enough to expand overseas. And plus they needed some kind of vitality, right, in terms of national vitality, which did not exist in other countries where people did not feel that they were parts of the same nation. So only nationalism could provoke people to expand overseas and hijack other countries as colonies. Okay, so basically, without a powerful sense of nationalism, it would have been hard for the European nations to expand overseas, in United States and Japan. Okay, so they were powerful enough, they had industry, they had tools, and plus they felt powerful nations, and they wanted, another important thing, they wanted to compete with other nations. Okay, so European nations wanted to compete with each other in the United States, and Japan wanted to compete with the European nations and the United States. For what? For the other parts of the world. So let's see how they expanded. So let's see how the world entered this stage of imperialism, I repeat, by the end of the 19th century. Okay. Let me open my presentation. So that's imperialism. So don't forget about the link, what I just emphasized, the connection between nationalism and imperialism. Out of this advanced development, imagining yourself as part of a nation, we have imperialism growing. It's a competition among nations, powerful nations. Competition over what? Over colonies. Africa, Asia, Pacific Islands, those places of the world which still remained unoccupied. Okay, and Europeans, Americans, and Japanese believed that they needed to expand in order to show off their power. So it was done for strategic purposes, okay, to dominate. And it happened on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, when Western nations and Japan became highly industrialized. They had military industry. They built what? Powerful ocean-going boats. They had cannons. Okay, they had machine guns. All these tools of expansion. But it was not strategic purposes. Desire to take over lands of the other people in order to dominate was not the only motivation for expansion. In fact, it was, I would say, not the first reason to expand. As always, if you want to see the ground, the root reasons of why things happen, you frequently need to look at, for economic reasons, look at the economy. And here, there were obvious economic interests on the part of Europeans. Not so much about Americans. I can't say about Americans because Americans did have their own territory to explore in the American West, you know. So Americans didn't need these raw materials, resources. But European nations and Japan, they needed resources. They needed mineral resources. They needed oil. They needed coal. They needed copper. They needed zinc. They needed some areas to plant rubber trees to feed the industry. So they wanted to take over colonies in order to take over resources. Okay, so Middle East, cotton and oil. So that's where Britain came. Malaya, rubber trees. That's where the Dutch came. Okay, they also wanted to invest money because remember, especially in Northern Europe, there's people who came from Protestant culture. They didn't want their money to stay idle. They wanted to invest their money somewhere. And colonies became a very good place for them to invest money. Okay, building railroads, mines. And as I said, strategic purposes were also important. National pride. The more colonies you have, the better. It was good. It's a big deal. So we need it. There was also so-called, quote unquote, a moral reason, or like a moral excuse. But for some Europeans, Americans, it was also a reason. They seriously believed into this. It's a desire to bring to non-Europeans the light of Christian church, the light of the true faith. Okay, so that is why they also sent missionaries. Like, remember, Spaniards had sent missionaries to the New World. Now we have a bunch of Protestant missionaries going to Africa, Asia, and by the end of the 19th century, when traditional religions started to decline, okay, because science, enlightenment, reason increased, the power of enlightenment, the power of science increased, and some educated people in the West, they came to embrace science as their secular faith. They believed in science. So many of them didn't talk about bringing Christianity. No way. You know, remember, those of you who read at least a little bit about European intellectual life, you know that this famous German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche, he even uttered this famous phrase, God is, quote, God is dead, unquote. So it was like a call to revolt against traditional church, to embrace science as the new religion, okay? And we talked about, remember, Jacobins, who were the first to introduce the cult of reason. So it's science became the new religion, okay? So how did these people who kind of stopped believing Christianity, they justified the expansion? They did, okay? There were many intellectuals and politicians by the 1900s who did not necessarily use like Christianity or economics as an excuse to expand, to take over other countries, Africa, Asia, Pacific Islands. What they did, they argued that they needed to civilize the other areas. That's what they claimed. So-called white man's burden. Okay, and of course, the most frank among them said, "Well, it's no big deal. The big fish eats the small fish." Remember, that's what that was the argument. Science. Remember, Charles Darwin said, the theory of evolution, that natural selection in the wildlife, the big fish eat small fish, survival of the fittest. For many educated people at that time, the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was a good excuse to justify the expansion overseas, because they argued, look, in the wildlife, in the animal world, animals fight with each other, and some big animals eat small animals. And the same thing in international politics, in geopolitics. We have big, powerful countries, and they expand, and they eat small countries. So the big fish eats the small fish. It's like, it even became known, what I just said, social Darwinism. So the laws of natural evolution were expanded to political life, international relations. Okay. But those people who were more benign, so to speak, they said, oh, no, it's not good to say this way, it's cruel. So our job of expansion should be justified by this duty of civilization. So we need to civilize other people. They thought about the rest of the world as savages, and they thought about themselves as the civilization heroes. And I repeat, they talked about who appealed to this civilization mission. They talked about white man's burden. This expression, white man's burden, it's in fact, it was the name of a poem by a British writer. Maybe you heard about him. His name is Rudyard Kipling. I'm sure you heard about Jungle Tales, right? Jungle Tales, about this little boy raised by wolves. Okay, if you didn't read the book, you might remember the cartoon, right? But the same guy, Kipling, he wrote this poem called "The White Man's Burden," and in fact, this poem was written in 1898. And this poem was addressed actually to the Americans, to be specific, to the American Congress. In this poem, basically, Kipling, I don't remember the exact, of course, quotations. I don't have this poem in front of me. But literally, the message was, you Americans need to expand overseas. I have to explain to you something. By the time he wrote this poem on a particular occasion, okay, United States, in fact, was among, in addition to Japan, was the late comer. The United States did not expand overseas before the very late 1800s. In fact, it was not until 1898 that Americans expanded overseas. They were not interested in international expansion. They were interested in trade. Remember, they sent some boats to Japan, trying to kind of push them, open your coastal cities for trade. But they were not interested in going somewhere and taking over like chunks of land somewhere in Africa and Asia. Okay, the United States was not a colonial power, unlike Britain and France or Germany. Why? Because Americans, they had their plenty of land inside the country. There was a huge area called the American West. There was Alaska. So there was plenty of areas to expand, to colonize. Okay. But when the American West was conquered, explored, okay, attached to the body, to the kind of main lane to the east of Mississippi. So Americans started looking beyond the final frontier, beyond the American West. And that's when they wanted to expand, to join the club of the other imperialist nations, okay? And the first area Americans wanted to expand was the Philippine Islands. What was special about the Philippine Islands? Philippine Islands had belonged to Spain, but Spain, remember, it was like an old dinosaur that was dying. The empire that was losing vitality. They didn't have enough, the spirit of enterprise. Remember, they had been spoiled by gold and silver, which they wasted, and eventually the empire started to go down. So they were losing their colonies. In Philippine Islands, people were revolting against the Spaniards. And in 1898, there was a revolt in the Philippine Islands against the Spanish Empire. And Americans decided to interfere to formally support the Philippine people against the Spaniards. Okay. And in fact, they wanted to occupy this area, to declare this area to U.S. territory. And there was a lot of opposition, in fact, in Congress, because some American legislators, they argued that, oh, we still don't need to expand. Why do you need this Philippine Islands? Okay. By the way, simultaneously, there was a debate to expand to Cuba or not, because Cuba also was about to secede from the Spanish Empire. And there was a revolt of Cubans against Spain. And Americans also wanted to go to Cuba to support Cubans against the Spaniards. Anyway, in the American Congress, there were many legislators who said, why do you need this expansion, imperialism? We still have plenty of land in the American West. And they were right. Although the wars with American Indians were over and American West was explored, right? But still, it was not cultivated yet, you know. Still, American West was a vast area, and Alaska was a vast area, still not cultivated. So that's what they used as an excuse. They said, why do you stick to your homeland? Okay, don't go overseas. But another part of Congress argued, yes, we need to expand overseas. We need to join the club of the other nations. Otherwise, people will not think about ourselves as powerful. So and eventually, after these debates, jumping a bit ahead, after these debates, the group of legislators who wanted to expand, they prevailed, and American troops went to Philippine Islands and to Cuba and occupied them. And there was a brief war, Spanish-American War. We're going to mention it again today, okay, at the end of this class, because it's important for us to know something about this war, okay. So Americans went against Spain, occupied Cuba, Philippine Islands, and these areas were added to these territories that were influenced by the United States. But during this debate in Congress, this guy, Kipling, English writer, he wrote a poem addressed to the American Congress where he said, you guys should not debate this. You have to go. You have to go overseas. That's your duty. Why was it duty? Because you guys had a duty to civilize these areas. Okay, even if you don't want to go, you have to go. See, that's what was on his mind and on the mind of many other enlightened people of Europe. Okay. And we need to know this because that's how the mindset of people worked, okay, at that time. But as I said, the majority of people simply use this social Darwinism slogan. So we have to go and take them over because they're weak, we're strong. Strong survive, weak people are defeated. And they argued that powerful nations know how to use the land and resources which were wasted by native people. Okay. And of course, at the end of the 19th century, racism becomes popular. Again, the racism, it's not only European or white thing. Okay, we have Japanese racism, very vicious, virulent racism. Racism directed against Chinese, against other people. Okay, in fact, later, Japanese were nicknamed by Germans. It's the Second World War, the Aryans of the Pacific. See a lot of this strange thinking. But again, it was linked to science. Everything was explained by science. Science was used to justify racism. Okay, so some races, that's how they justified it. They said some races were strong, some races were weak, and the strong races were destined to conquer the weak races, and that's what science said. See, that's why I'm saying that everything was justified by science. Okay, in fact, the later quote unquote science was invented, science of racism. This name of the science was called eugenics. Okay, and thousands of intellectuals, in fact, considered as a truth science. They believed into this. Can you imagine? So they believed that it was that's how it was developed in natural evolution. Okay, some races were destined to win, other races were destined to lose. Okay, so you know, during each age there are certain popular, I would say, didn't want to use the strong word, you know. There are some strange ideas, you know, including our age, you know, when millions of people believe in something which like 2 generations after they will be ashamed of, you know. Just look around us and you will see there are certain popular things which we're forced to do today, these days, and people tell us, oh, this is science. Science tell us story, you know. So if you're against this, you're against the science, okay? But science, it's it's not some kind of ironclad religion. It's scientists, they debate things. Science is not some kind of consensus, you know. Science is it's open. It's an open project, you know. There are different viewpoints in science, okay. But people always, some people try to convince us that their way, the way they think, that's the science, okay. So be always aware of this, you know. Don't buy into this quote unquote science, you know, like especially be aware of those people who force you to accept one particular viewpoint, okay, and they tell you this is the science, okay. Be aware of these people, okay. Skepticism is a good thing. So going back to that time, that's what I want to tell you, that at that time, thousands of intellectuals, they actually agreed with this eugenics, this science about races, and they said, hey, this science, so we have to go overseas because the science tells us so, you know. See, that's a very dangerous thing, you know. Sometimes this so-called quote-unquote science, which is not science, by the way, you know, it's simply an excuse to impose your power, okay, on somebody else, to tell people this it should be my way and not any other way, you know. That's what it was based on. There were very different imperialisms, by the way, you know. Imperialism, it was imposition, but in all fairness, there were different types of imperialism. For example, and I wanted to show to you 3 types of imperialism, which we may find at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, of course, imperialism was an imposition, but at the same time, if you, for instance, compare how French, the British, the Germans behaved in Africa, Asia, and other countries, it was quite different. For example, French colonial agents, they were thinking in terms of assimilation. They wanted to assimilate like Africans Asians, let's say in Western Africa, the French wanted to assimilate local people into French culture. They wanted them to learn French manners, culture, and even gave them citizenship. Can you imagine? Which was a very unusual thing, okay? Because no other country gave her colonial subjects citizenship, but French were the first. In fact, in Western Africa, in Asia, modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, they gave citizenship to local people as early as 1848. 1848, citizenship. So a right local people, right of local people to elect and be elected. And in fact, one African from Western Africa who as a delegate was sent from Western Africa to the French Parliament to sit in the French Parliament, which was an unusual thing. Okay, not a bad thing. That was done. Okay. At the same time, they wanted to convert Africans and Asians to Catholicism, like Vietnamese people were here. See, they tried to enforce these things. Obviously, you cannot say it was a good thing because it was imposition. They tried to impose Catholicism, or on African people, Catholicism was imposed. At the same time, the French colonial agents, they were fighting epidemic diseases, and they were also fighting against slavery. Remember, France was one of the first countries to abolish slavery. Okay, although Napoleon, as I told you before, Napoleon did reintroduce slavery that had been eliminated by the French Revolution. Still, in 1830s, 1840s, France abolished slavery. Okay, and the former slaves received the right to become citizens, as I said, in 1848. Received the right to become citizens. So, but some people in inland areas of Africa, some indigenous Africans still practice slavery, by the way, and that's what the French colonial agents, they were fighting against this. We have to admit that's a fact. British, unlike French, they were more, I would say, they were not as open as French. Okay, the British practiced indirect rule in relationships with the like Asian and African colonies. What does it mean, indirect rule? The British administered their colonies not directly, but they delegated power to local chiefs. They didn't like to mingle with natives. They didn't want to assimilate indigenous people. Okay, they always dealt with natives through indigenous middlemen, local chiefs. Okay, and they thought it would help them to reduce administrative costs. But like French, the British also were fighting against slavery. We know that Britain was, like France, one of the first countries to abolish slavery. And in fact, English boats were chasing Spanish, American, and Portuguese slave boats, confiscating them, penalizing them. Remember, Britain abolished the slave trade in 1808 and abolished slavery completely in 1830. 1830. So very early. Okay. And in fact, in those areas that had been colonized by Britain, British outlawed slavery. So when indigenous Africans who practiced slavery tried to do it, so they were penalized by the British. So that was done. Okay. But German imperialism was very brutal compared to British and French imperialism. So for some reason, but obviously it was a desire to plunder, to extract as many resources as possible. That's what explains this German brutal treatment of colonial people. And maybe another reason, because Germany was a latecomer to this pie of colonial, to the table of colonial powers, and they wanted to grab as many pieces of land as possible. Okay. Germans became notorious for the brutal treatment of their colonial subjects. For example, Germans were able to seize Eastern Africa, it's present-day Tanzania, and Southwestern Africa, it's present-day Namibia. And they also came to control Cameroon, where they brutally treated people. Okay, hardly didn't invest anything in develop an industry, unlike French, didn't care about epidemic diseases, of course. And never, by the way, Germans never outlawed slavery, so they continued slavery in colonies. Okay. In fact, they tried to suppress brutally by the force of arms any complaints of locals. And both in Tanzania and Namibia, we have brutal wars between natives and Germans. Okay. Especially bloody was the war against indigenous people, indigenous African people in Namibia, where Germans, in fact, introduced concentration camps, okay, which, as we know later, were reintroduced by Hitler before and during the Second World War. Okay. But British also used concentration camps. You will see it. I will mention it later. Okay, throughout this presentation. What all colonial powers introduced, Germans, the British, the French, despite the differences, some of them were more benign, some of them in between, and some of them, like Germans, were very brutal. Okay, it was monoculture. Okay, in many colonies, Europeans introduced so-called monoculture. Monoculture, it's when colonial mother country enforced like one crop on one occupation on colonial countries. So, for example, incentivizing natives or forcing natives to do one thing. Let's say, again, let's take what, for example, like Cameroon. Let's imagine Cameroon, it's a Central African colony. At first, it was controlled by Germans, but then French came to control this colony. And let's say natives who lived in Cameroon grew bananas, they had domesticated animals, they grew a little bit of coffee, they also planted some potatoes, so they diverse things, subsistence agriculture. And here, let's say Germans come and force them, telling them, you have to grow coffee, or paying them a lot of money, encourage them to grow coffee, and the entire colony switches to coffee, and everybody begins to grow coffee. So that's what monoculture. Mono means one. It's a Latin language. Mono means one. So in colonies, people were frequently forced to do one thing, to grow one crop, to do one like economic occupation, like to mine coal. Okay, nothing else. So monoculture was, of course, not exactly a good thing. In fact, it could bring a disaster, and it did bring a disaster on many occasions. How? Let's say you have high prices for coffee. Everybody buys it. But what about, let's say, the next year, there is a crisis, economy goes down, there is too much coffee produced everywhere. So the whole market, world market, is infested with coffee. So the prices for coffee go down, but you don't know anything, you don't do anything except growing coffee. What, you have nothing to eat. You don't have domestic animals, you don't plant potatoes, so you might even die from hunger, right? Because nothing can be done with your coffee. So that is why monoculture is so bad, okay? I will give you today two examples of imperialism. Two, I would say, textbook examples of imperialism, how this expansion was done in real life. Okay, and I chose two countries, China and Africa, two areas, China and Africa, to show to you how quickly in this fast mode the European nations and Japan expanded overseas. And I'm talking particularly about so-called Opium War, okay? Because it's a very good example to see how European nations treated non-European nations. there was a practice in the parts of China. There was a habit, not common, limited habit in parts of China to smoke opium. You know, opium, it's a drug. It's a poppy seeds, okay? Poppy seeds, here you can see it. And in parts of China, people after a hard working day, they went to particular parlors where they smoked opium, relaxing. But it wasn't widespread, okay? But then Dutch come, and they were the first to trade in opium. They started to grow and sell it, including China, Southeastern Asia. Okay, then English followed. So soon we have a bunch of smugglers who smuggled opium in China, like thousands of tons. Okay, and the habit of smoking opium became widespread. The whole areas of China became addicted to smoking opium. So it became like a national catastrophe. Like a bunch of Chinese peasants were hooked on this drug, you know. So Chinese government banned smoking and trade in opium for health reasons. But the English wanted to continue this because it was a profitable business. Plus, the English government wanted to open China for the foreign trade. But China was a very closed country. Very closed country. The China didn't want to open herself for various reasons. Of course, the fact that they did not want to open themselves for foreign trade eventually retarded them. They started lagging behind because they were not interested too much in Western technology, in Western science. Of course, did not contribute to their economy. Okay? It retarded their economy. But that was their choice. Okay. But England wanted to drag them into this foreign trade, and the English sent a few delegates at the end of the 1700s, royal delegates, asking them to please, please open your country for the foreign trade. But the Chinese said, you barbarians, Europeans, we don't care about you. We do not need anything from you. Okay. And of course, the English government was mad. And that is why the English government, in fact, started to encourage smuggling opium into China. Okay. In 1838, China's government faced such a desperate situation when it became the national disaster, their smoking of opium. Okay, so the Chinese introduced a total embargo on British goods. They said, we're not going to buy anything, not a single spoon, not a single piece of fabric from you, until you stop trading opium. You bring it illegally, you smuggle this in, just tell your smugglers, your merchants, stop doing this. Okay, we're against this. So negotiations started, okay? And when negotiations were going on, a British superintendent, a British agent in China, Charles Elliot, he demanded all British merchants to bring the opium and pile it together in a big, huge pile. Okay. But some Chinese, I guess it could be officials or maybe some Chinese people who hated this opium trade, they set on fire the pile of opium. It destroyed the whole storage, and the English were mad, of course, about it. Okay. So the English declares war on China. Okay, asking China to apologize, to pay back. China didn't want. So one word, one harsh word, another harsh word in return, and eventually this bickering, diplomatic bickering, escalated into war, and Britain declared war on China, and she was joined by France. Okay, so France and England attacked China. At first it was Britain alone in 1830, and then it was France that joined England. Originally, there were two Opium Wars. These wars against China, they became known as Opium Wars. There were two wars. One war was conducted in 1830s, and the second war in 1860s. Okay, so during the first war, it was England against China, and England defeated the Chinese because England had industry. They had modern guns, they had modern boats. Okay, and the Chinese military was very primitive. So quickly, the English defeated the Chinese, and Chinese had to beg them to stop fighting. Then, when the Chinese still didn't want to back off, England declared the Second War, Opium War, and that's when the English were joined by the French, and eventually a treaty was signed between China on the one hand and England and France on the other hand, called Treaty of Tientsin, 1860, which was a very, very unequal treaty. So China lost a lot as a result of this treaty. In fact, China lost control over her coastal cities. So entire coastal areas of China were open to foreign countries. Particularly, there were a list of countries, and these countries were England, France, Germany, Japan, Russia. So these cities, the major cities, Beijing, Nanking, Canton, you name them, 5 or 6 coastal cities were totally open for foreign trade. And in fact, in these coastal cities, Chinese government didn't have right to impose the customs duties. In these coastal cities, foreign countries had the right to create their own neighborhoods where foreign currency was used. In German neighborhoods of Chinese cities, Deutsche Marks were used. In British quarters, British neighborhoods, British pounds, okay, and so forth and so forth. Plus, China had to pay France and England and France redemption money, a lot of money in silver, okay, as a result of this treaty. And look, on top of this, originally England promised that as soon as we settle this, sign the treaty, we settle this war, we will stop selling opium, you know, just open your country for a trade. Although now country was open, totally open for a trade. England legalized the sale of opium, see? The trade in opium was legalized and in fact expanded to many, many other areas of China. So here's the map, something for you to look. In fact, it's a good map. You can see how Western countries and Japan, like vultures, try to tear apart Chinese territory. And you can see here, like Germany, for instance, came to control this area. Japan came to control this and this area. Britain, of course, was the greatest beneficiary. She controlled the most fertile area. This area, it's a central China, okay, very fertile area, and also Tibet, so north of India. In fact, Britain sent here military expedition where they attacked Tibetan troops, defeated them, and occupied this area. Even Russia, which, by the way, was not an advanced country, Russia was a semi-backward country, peasant country, which was not yet industrialized, but she was in the process of industrialization, like Japan. So even Russia, backward Russia, was trying to buy the chunk of the Chinese territory. See, they took over this area from China. Okay. Now Africa, another area, as I said, there were 2 areas I'm going to use to show you how imperialism was done at the end of by the end of the 19th century. Okay. Africa became one of the major objects of expansion for the Europeans at that time. Okay. Prior to 1880s, Africa was avoided by Western colonizers. Why? In fact, we did talk about Africa. Remember, we talked We explored the slave trade. We also, in the beginning of the semester, we mentioned the Portuguese who created the supply stations along the African coast, right? But the interesting thing, hardly any European dared to penetrate the inland areas of Africa, okay? So they were afraid to go there. Why? Because of devastating diseases. In fact, Africa was called white man's graveyard. So Europeans had no immunity for yellow fever and other tropical diseases. So they died like flies here. Okay, even those Europeans who did not exactly go to inland areas, who lived in coastal areas, they didn't live a long life either. So they quickly died. But what happened in the 1880s? In the 1880s, a scramble for Africa started. 1880s, 1890s. So suddenly all Europeans rushed to occupy as many parts of Africa as possible, and even argued with each other. So this is mine, no, this is mine. They argued about particular areas of Africa, okay, especially French and English. Why such sudden rush? Why had it been fear prior to the 1880s, and why such a rush since the 1880s? Here's the explanation. Medicine for malaria, yellow fever was invented. So that's what eased expansion. So now it was not white man's graveyard anymore. So we have a bunch of colonizers coming there, trying to seize as much territory as possible. See, by the way, let me show you. See, that's how the map of Africa looked, 1500s. And now look, by the 1800s, entire continent of Africa was occupied by European countries. All areas of Africa were occupied by a few European countries, which were, I repeat, France, England, Germany, and Portugal. The only country, African country, that was occupied was Ethiopia. Why? Because it was a Christian country. There was no justification to come here. So remember, one of the big excuses for the Europeans was that we need to expand here because we want to bring the light of Christianity to local areas. So that is why it was hard to justify expansion to Ethiopia, Abyssinia, it was called at that time, because it had been a Christian country. In fact, one of the most ancient branches of Christianity is here, so-called Coptic Christianity. It's indigenous, by the way. It's an indigenous African Christianity, if you don't know, okay? Because the other types of Christianity that were imported into Africa, they came from Europe primarily, or from the United States. The only indigenous Christianity that had been brought here in most ancient times, from where? From Palestine through Egypt, was Coptic Christianity, Coptic, okay? So European countries come and divide all these areas. In fact, they literally took pencils and rulers, tried to define the borders because they didn't want to fight each other. Okay, but at the same time, they wanted to grab as much territory as possible. So literally taking the rulers and pencils and stretching these borders, like drawing direct lines. In Berlin, by the way, in Berlin, Germans who were upset that, unlike the French and the English, they didn't have a chance to create big colonial empires. Only at the very end of the 19th century, Germans finally were able to expand overseas, okay? So they were jealous. They wanted to have chunks of colonial territories too. So Germans in 1883 invited all major Western nations for a conference in Berlin, capital of Germany. for a conference to negotiate how we need to expand to Africa. And that's what we call a scramble for Africa. Okay. And I repeat, on many occasions, they literally took rulers and pencils and drawing these geometrical grid lines. And that's how many African borders, they look like direct grids, which you don't see in other areas. Okay. Maybe except US and Canada, where also we have this geometrical grid, geometrical line, straight line. Here, by the way, in Egypt, in Sudan, French troops and English troops expanded, and here they met each other. And on one occasion, they were about to fight each other. Okay, only at the last moment, commanders of both detachments said, "Chill out, guys, enough land for everybody." So that's what we call scramble for Africa. Okay, scramble for Africa. We have an interesting phenomenon during this time, at the very end of the 19th century. And what I just said about these two groups of colonizers, French and British, on the Sudanese border facing each other, ready to fight, it's a very important example, because I'm going to use this to explain to you something, okay? At the very end of the 19th century, by the 1900s, when the whole globe was divided among the major European countries, plus the United States and Japan, we already have European countries and Japan fighting against each other over the lands they didn't belong to them. See, they occupied so many lands, and there was no more land left. They started to fight each other, to quarrel with each other, because the whole globe was already divided, and now they wanted to redivide the globe. And that's how we have these small, I would say, imperialist wars all over the world, small wars among European countries, US and Japan, for the domination of the world. And one of the first wars like this took place in southernmost part of Africa, so-called Cape Colony. It's a present-day South African Republic. Okay, here we have, by the time when this war started, and it started in 1898 and continued, lasted until 1902, it became known as so-called Anglo-Boer War. Anglo-Boer War. Before this war started, in this part of Africa, we have two slave states had been built by the Dutch colonizers, who came here very early as the 1600s. Okay, remember, during the time of this first attempt of European expansion overseas. So the Dutch colonizers came here, they settled here, okay. But in the 19th century, English come here, and they were squeezing the Dutch. The Dutch were farmers. They took over land. There was a fertile land, okay. Some land was unoccupied, other lands were occupied, so there were fights between colonizers and local people. Simultaneously, there was a big confederation of Zulu people who came here, okay, from the north, also fighting against local Africans, and the Dutch farmers, Dutch colonizers, okay. These Dutch colonizers, since they were farmers, they created these big plantations, and they had slaves, by the way, they had slaves. And local African tribes also practiced slavery, so everybody practiced here slavery, okay. The Zulu Confederation also practiced slavery. So these Dutch farmers who came to occupy this area, who colonized this area, they were nicknamed Boers, Afrikaner Boers. Boer means, in Dutch, Boer means farmer. So Afrikaner Boers, which means African farmers. That's how they became known. But then the British come, or English. They come here and they squeeze out the Dutch, squeeze them out, and the Dutch escape. That's how they look, these Dutch settlers, okay? Dutch farmers. They displaced indigenous people here, but then the English come and they displaced them. So these Dutch, they had to escape to inland areas, and they created two slave states. One called Transvaal, and another was called Orange Free State. A strange name, the ironic name, although I repeat, it was a slave state. The Dutch farmers, they owned African slaves here, but it's called Orange Free State. The Dutch farmers, Boers, practiced apartheid system. Apartheid, it means strict segregation. You heard about segregation. So they totally separated races. So they separated themselves from local Africans and used them only as slaves. Marriages were forbidden, of course, and interaction between two races was minimized. It became known as apartheid, okay, separation of races. But when Britain came, they started to fight against slavery, and that's what the slave-holding people didn't like, Boers. They resented that Britain was fighting against slavery. And in fact, that's how England attracted a lot of local Africans to their side, because they said, we're against slavery. Okay, Britain was against slavery. But the Boers and local Africans were pro-slavery, in fact. Okay, that's an interesting thing. So Boers escaped to the north. As I said, it became known as the Great Trek. They escaped to the north, drive away local people, defeat the Zulu people. Against Zulu, it was a confederation, a big confederation in South Africa, and set up two independent republics, slave republics. But the discovery of diamonds in this particular area made British what? To move further. So Britain didn't want to leave local Africans and these slaveholders, the Dutch farmers, alone. They wanted to occupy the entire area because diamonds were discovered on the lands of Africans, and the Boers. And the gold was discovered too. So England wanted to take over the entire South Africa. Okay, that's it, period. Entire area. What is interesting, I forgot to mention, it's very important to be mentioned. South Africa is one of those few spots on the globe that literally has all kinds of mineral resources. You can find here any kind of minerals. You look at the periodical table of chemical, like periodical table of elements. You may see in South Africa almost all of them, from copper and zinc to diamonds and gold and coal and everything, and copper, any kind of stuff. Okay, here you can see the exploitation of diamond mines. Africans working on diamond mines. So the first group people to be defeated by the British was Zulu people. Zulu, it was a militarized confederation, a loosely organized tribes. One of the prominent chiefs of the Zulu Confederation was Shaka Zulu. Maybe you heard this name. They practiced farming, warlike society. So Britain first attacked them and defeated them. Britain, of course, had technology, guns, okay, cannons, and Zulu people could not withstand this. They had spears and bows and spears, shields. They could not protect themselves. So they were defeated. And then they attacked these two slave republics. Okay, it's a very important war, and bloody war started between the Boers and the English. So Boers didn't want to back off. They had guns, they had cannons, and they were skillful fighters. And soon a large British army was involved, and Boers didn't want to give up. And that's when England introduced concentration camps. Here you can see a picture of South African concentration camps for Boers organized by the British. Okay, so here English brought the families, men, since men were fighting against the British, so British brought to these concentration camps women and Boers, women and children, and plus their African slaves were brought here. And a lot of people died because they were underfed. There were diseases, rampant diseases, and I repeat, it was something that later, the next century, in the beginning of the 20th century, or to be specific, in the first half of the 20th century, was used on a big scale, on a grand scale. Concentration camps. See where, as I said, Germany introduced concentration camps in Namibia. Okay, it was very close, and this close to this area. Namibia, in fact, is here. It's called German Southwest Africa. That's Namibia. Here, Germans also introduced concentration camps to break the resistance of indigenous people. And in these slave republics, Britain did the same thing to break the resistance of Boers. They placed their women and children in concentration camps. Okay, starving them, killing them, and eventually broke their resistance. Why is it so important? Again, these local experiences used in Africa later were used on a grand scale in Europe. Okay, during the Second World War, during the First World War, and the Second World War. Plus, okay, see, these are the concentration camps. 27,000 people died in these concentration camps from diseases and hunger. Okay. All right, remember I told you about these local wars that were fought by imperialist nations. So these small wars popped up here and there, okay, because different groups of colonizers, they challenged each other. In South Africa, we have Anglo-Boer War, 1898-1900, which I just mentioned. We have Spanish-American War, which I also mentioned. Okay, war U.S. against Spain over Cuba and Philippine Islands. And also we have Russo-Japanese War. It's a fight over northeastern China, okay, because Japan wanted to grab the entire part of northeastern China, but Russia said, no, it's our chunk of land, don't go there, and they started fighting each other. And in fact, Russia was defeated by Japan, which is an interesting example, the first case in modern history when nominally European country was defeated by an Asian nation. There was also a French-German conflict over Morocco in 1910. So France and Germany almost fought each other over Morocco because France grabbed these places in northern Africa. But Germans said, oh, we wanted this, you're not right. And eventually they were able to avoid the war because a compromise was offered. Okay, compromise was offered. They made exchange of lands. Okay, so France said, we are going to give you a chunk of land in Central Africa. I think it's Cameroon. I think, yeah, Cameroon originally was owned by Germans, then France gave it to Germans, but after the First World War, when Germany was defeated, France again took it over. So anyway, it's before the First World War, because of this fight over Morocco, France said, hey, go ahead and take this piece of land in Central Africa and leave for us Morocco. And Germans said, okay, guys. What I'm trying to tell you that we have a bunch of small wars which eventually escalated in a big war. And that's how eventually a big war starts, okay? A war between one group of Europeans against another group of Europeans. Essentially, what I'm trying to tell you right now, I'm trying to explain to you one of the origins of the First World War. Okay, you heard about First World War. It's going to be a topic we're going to discuss, okay? next time. And one of the reasons First World War started, and it was not the only reason, this fight over the globe, who would dominate the world, but one of the chief reasons was this fight over who would dominate what areas of the world. Okay, there were other reasons for the war, the political ambitions, playing competition for power in Europe, but one of the chief reasons was this desire to grab colonies, and different groups of Europeans competed with each other over colonies. And out of these small wars, we have the big war emerging, which became known as the First World War. But it's another story which we will explore next time. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.